are lives that inspire envy from a distance, careers that appear to have been constructed with precision and intention, trajectories that follow the script society has written for success. Arman Qureshi's life, viewed from the outside, was precisely this kind of achievement, a 40-year-old man occupying a senior position at Davidson & Partners, a multinational consulting firm with offices in 17 countries, his name appearing on organizational charts with the kind of proximity to the top that suggested he'd climbed successfully while others had faltered or plateaued or simply given up. His corner office occupied prime real estate on the 42nd floor of a glass tower in the financial district, walls of floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of the city sprawling below, a vista that was supposed to represent achievement but that Arman had stopped noticing years ago, the cityscape becoming mere background to the endless parade of video conferences and spreadsheets and presentations that consumed his days. The office itself was furnished with the careful neutrality of corporate success, a mahogany desk selected by facilities management, ergonomic chair adjusted to optimal settings, diplomas and awards arranged on walls in configurations that suggested accomplishment without arrogance. People who worked with Arman described him as accomplished, strategic, reliable, the kind of professional who could be counted on to deliver results, to navigate complex client relationships, to represent the firm at industry conferences and high-stakes negotiations. His calendar was a testament to his importance, back-to-back meetings starting at 7 a.m. and extending past 7 p.m., blocks of time color-coded by priority and project, every 15-minute increment accounted for and allocated. His colleagues joked that scheduling time with Arman required booking 3 weeks in advance, and he'd learned to receive this as a compliment rather than a criticism, evidence of how essential he'd become to the organization's functioning. His compensation reflected this value, a salary that had grown incrementally but substantially over 18 years at the firm, bonuses tied to performance metrics he consistently exceeded, stock options that had appreciated considerably, benefits that included business class travel and a car allowance and health insurance that covered everything imaginable. He lived in a condominium in a neighborhood that had gentrified from industrial to desirable, paying monthly fees that would have horrified his parents but that felt appropriate for someone of his professional standing. He wore suits tailored to fit precisely, shoes Italian and leather, watches that cost more than most people's monthly rent. From the outside, Arman Qureshi had achieved what the implicit social contract promised: work hard, climb diligently, sacrifice strategically, and you'll arrive at success. You'll have the title, the income, the respect. You'll be someone people admire at dinner parties and whose career trajectory younger professionals study as a template for their own ambitions. What people didn't see, what Arman had become extraordinarily skilled at concealing behind professional competence and carefully maintained composure, was how exhausted success had made him. How the achievement that looked impressive from outside felt increasingly like a prison constructed from obligations he could no longer remember choosing. How somewhere in the years of climbing and proving and exceeding expectations, he'd stopped recognizing himself in the mirror, had become someone who executed perfectly but felt nothing, who succeeded constantly but couldn't quite remember what he was succeeding toward. Every morning, Arman's alarm sounded at 5:30 a.m., not because he needed 2 hours before work began, but because arriving at the office by 7 o'clock had become part of his identity, evidence of dedication that he feared losing would render him replaceable. He'd shower with the efficiency of someone performing a necessary function rather than experiencing a sensory pleasure, dress in variations of the same professional uniform, consume coffee and minimal breakfast while scanning emails that had accumulated overnight from colleagues in different time zones. The commute took 40 minutes, subway to financial district, elevator to 42nd floor, greetings exchanged with security and administrative staff who knew him by name and with whom he maintained friendly but distant relationships. By the time he reached his desk, Arman would already be halfway through his first coffee, his mind cataloging the day's meetings and deliverables, his body moving through familiar rhythms while some deeper part of him, the part he'd learned to ignore, wondered what, exactly, he was hurrying toward. Meetings consumed most of his days. Client presentations where he'd deploy practiced charm and strategic thinking to secure contracts worth millions. Internal strategy sessions where he'd advocate for approaches he believed would be effective even if he no longer found them interesting. Performance reviews where he'd offer carefully calibrated feedback designed to motivate without discouraging. Video conferences with international colleagues where time zones meant someone was always working outside normal hours, the firm's global presence requiring constant connectivity that made true disconnection impossible. Arman was good at meetings. Exceptionally good. He'd learned to read room dynamics, to identify decision-makers and influence them through carefully framed arguments, to build consensus while maintaining the appearance that the consensus had emerged organically rather than through his orchestration. He spoke fluently in corporate language, synergies and optimizations and strategic alignments, while translating these abstractions into concrete actions that teams could execute. His presentations were polished, his data visualizations clear, his recommendations supported by analysis that appeared objective even when it reflected his intuitive judgments dressed in quantitative clothing. People trusted Arman's judgment, relied on his expertise, sought his input on decisions ranging from hiring to strategy to crisis management. He'd become the person others consulted when they needed problems solved or conflicts mediated or difficult conversations conducted with diplomatic precision. This trust was gratifying and also exhausting. Every consultation was another claim on his time and attention, another obligation to meet others' needs while his own remained persistently unexamined. He left the office late. Not every night, but most nights. Partly because the work demanded it, deadlines that couldn't be moved, crises that required immediate attention, clients in different time zones whose schedules determined his availability. But partly because leaving felt like admitting he had nothing more important waiting for him, and this admission carried a loneliness he preferred to avoid by simply staying busy. The routine had calcified over years until it no longer felt like choice but like the only possible way to live. Wake early, work intensely, perform excellence, repeat. Weekends were for recovering enough energy to sustain the cycle, for handling personal logistics that couldn't be addressed during the week, for maintaining relationships that had become increasingly shallow as he'd become increasingly unavailable. He had friends, technically, people he'd known for years, whose weddings he'd attended and whose children's names he remembered, but the friendships had atrophied into occasional dinners where everyone performed interest in each other's lives while actually thinking about work obligations waiting on Monday. Arman spoke often about growth, professional development, market expansion, strategic positioning. The language of upward trajectory pervaded his conversations and his thinking. But if someone had asked him when he'd last experienced genuine growth rather than just accumulation, when he'd last felt himself becoming more rather than just having more, he wouldn't have been able to answer. Somewhere along the journey from ambitious 22-year-old to accomplished 40-year-old, ambition had transformed into obligation. The drive that had initially felt energizing had become a treadmill he couldn't step off without feeling he was failing. Success had revealed itself as not a destination but a constantly receding horizon, each achievement creating new expectations, each milestone becoming a baseline for the next required accomplishment. And Arman was so tired. Not physically tired, though he was that too. But tired in a deeper way, the exhaustion that comes from sustaining performance that no longer connects to purpose, from optimizing a life that no longer feels worth living even as it looks increasingly impressive from outside. What people saw when they looked at Arman Qureshi was success. What Arman felt when he looked at himself, in the rare moments he allowed himself to look honestly rather than through the lens of professional achievement, was a kind of desperate emptiness, a hollowness at the center of all that accomplishment. He'd built exactly the life he was supposed to want. And discovered, too late, that building it had cost him the ability to want anything at all. The evening that changed everything arrived disguised as ordinary frustration. Arman was stuck in traffic on a Tuesday, the kind of gridlock that made the city feel claustrophobic and hostile, brake lights stretching ahead for blocks while the clock on his dashboard reminded him he was late for a dinner obligation he didn't particularly want to attend but had committed to weeks ago. He should have been responding to emails on his phone. Multitasking was how he'd learned to extract productivity from otherwise wasted time, but something made him just sit there, hands on the steering wheel, staring through the windshield at nothing in particular. And that's when he noticed the street musician. The man was stationed on the sidewalk near the intersection where Arman's car sat immobilized, playing an acoustic guitar that had seen better decades. The instrument was battered, finish worn off in places from years of handling, a crack running along its side held together with what looked like superglue and hope, but the sound it produced was surprisingly clean, melody lines rising above the traffic noise with a clarity that suggested the player knew what he was doing. What struck Arman wasn't the music itself, though it was competent. What struck him was the musician's face. The man was perhaps 50, weathered in the way of people whose lives were lived largely outdoors, wearing layers of clothing that suggested limited access to laundry or maybe just pragmatic preparation for temperature variations. His guitar case lay open at his feet, containing coins that numbered in the dozens rather than anything approaching substantial income. No crowd had gathered, the sidewalk traffic flowed past him with the practiced obliviousness of urban dwellers who'd learned to navigate around street performers without actually seeing them. The man wasn't performing for an audience. Wasn't adjusting his playing or his position to attract attention or maximize tips. He was just playing. For himself, apparently. Or for the act of playing itself, detached from outcomes or compensation or anyone's evaluation of his performance. And he was smiling. Not the performance smile Arman knew so well, the one deployed for clients and colleagues. But genuine pleasure, the expression of someone engaged in an activity they found intrinsically satisfying regardless of external validation. The contrast between this man's evident contentment and Arman's own internal state hit with unexpected force. Here was someone with presumably far less material success, far fewer resources, far lower status by any conventional metric. Yet he appeared to possess something Arman had misplaced years ago, the ability to find satisfaction in an activity pursued for its own sake rather than for what it might produce or prove. Traffic began moving. Arman drove forward, but the image of the smiling musician stayed with him, not dramatically, not as some kind of revelation, but as a small crack in the carefully maintained architecture of his professional identity. A suggestion that perhaps success and satisfaction were not as synonymous as he'd been assuming. That perhaps optimizing for one might actually preclude the other. 3 days later, Arman stood at the front of a boardroom presenting quarterly results to the firm's partners and senior leadership. The numbers were exceptional, revenue growth exceeding projections, client retention at all-time highs, pipeline development suggesting continued strong performance. He delivered the presentation with his usual polish, each slide designed for maximum clarity and impact, his verbal framing emphasizing strategic implications and opportunities for expansion. Applause filled the room when he finished. Congratulations were offered. His name was mentioned as exemplifying the firm's values of excellence and client focus. The managing partner made a comment about Arman being invaluable to the organization's continued success. Arman smiled, acknowledged the praise with appropriate humility, participated in the brief discussion of next quarter's priorities. And felt absolutely nothing, not pride. Not satisfaction. Not even the mild pleasure of recognition. Just a kind of hollow performing, going through motions that had become so practiced they no longer required his authentic presence. He was executing a role, successful senior consultant acknowledging professional achievement, while the part of him that might once have found this genuinely gratifying had apparently gone dormant or died or just disappeared into the accumulated exhaustion of 18 years of constant striving. That night, alone in his condominium, expensive and tastefully decorated and somehow never feeling like home despite 4 years of residence, Arman found himself opening drawers he normally ignored. Looking through closets that held items he'd accumulated but never examined. Searching for something without quite knowing what. In a box at the back of his bedroom closet, beneath winter clothes he rarely needed in the city's moderate climate, he found an old notebook. Leather cover worn soft, pages slightly yellowed, his handwriting from years ago filling its contents. He'd kept journals sporadically in his 20s, before work had consumed all available time and energy. These weren't diaries in the confessional sense but repositories for ideas, business concepts he'd been exploring, observations about organizations and effectiveness, sketches of approaches he thought might be valuable. Reading through them now felt like encountering a stranger who happened to share his handwriting. The observations were enthusiastic in a way he no longer recognized. Full of curiosity about how things worked, excitement about possibilities, genuine interest in questions that didn't have immediate practical application. This earlier version of himself had apparently found thinking inherently pleasurable rather than just instrumentally useful. And there, near the end of the notebook, a single sentence he'd written at some point, he couldn't remember when or what had prompted it. Success should feel like breathing, not drowning. Arman sat on his bedroom floor, notebook open to that page, and felt something shift in his chest. When had success started feeling like drowning? When had achievement become burden rather than satisfaction? When had he stopped being someone who found professional challenges energizing and become someone who endured them through sheer disciplined performance? He couldn't identify a specific moment. Just a gradual accumulation of choices that had seemed reasonable individually but had accumulated into a life that felt less like his own and more like a role he'd been cast in and had become too committed to abandon. That night, Arman didn't sleep. Or rather, he lay in bed and watched the ceiling and thought about the trajectory his life had followed and whether that trajectory was actually taking him anywhere he wanted to arrive. Over the following weeks, Arman began noticing things he'd previously ignored or rationalized away. The way he felt a tight anxiety in his chest on Sunday evenings, anticipating Monday's return to the office. The way he'd stopped reading anything except business publications and work-related materials, as if his capacity for curiosity had been entirely colonized by professional demands. The way his calendar was filled with other people's priorities while his own, if he even had any distinct from the role he performed, remained perpetually deferred. He started asking himself questions he'd been carefully not asking for years. Why am I working this hard? The obvious answer was career advancement, financial security, professional reputation. But he'd already achieved advancement, was senior enough that further climbing would be incremental rather than transformative. Already had financial security, his savings and investments meant he could live modestly for years without working. Already had reputation, was recognized and respected in his field. So why was he still driving himself with the intensity of someone desperate to prove something? What was he trying to prove, and to whom? What would I do if I weren't afraid? The question arrived uninvited during a particularly tedious meeting about process optimization. Arman was half listening to colleagues debate whether status reports should be submitted weekly or bi-weekly, his mind wandering to the more fundamental question: if fear weren't constraining his choices, what would he actually choose? The answer, when it finally came, surprised him: less. He'd choose less. Fewer obligations, fewer performances, fewer hours spent optimizing systems he didn't care about for goals that felt arbitrary. He'd choose space, for thinking without immediate practical application, for relationships without transactional purpose, for activities pursued simply because they interested him. But he was afraid. Afraid of being judged as someone who'd given up or failed to reach his potential. Afraid of disappointing people who admired his success. Afraid of discovering that without his professional identity, he had no identity at all. When did I last feel genuinely excited about my work? Arman tried to remember and couldn't. There'd been moments of satisfaction, problems elegantly solved, difficult clients successfully managed, presentations that had landed perfectly. But excitement? The kind of eager anticipation that makes you want to arrive early and stay late because the work itself is compelling? He couldn't recall experiencing that in years. What he felt instead was obligation. The work needed to be done, and he was good at doing it, so he did it. Competently, professionally, without complaint. But also without any genuine engagement beyond the performance of engagement. He'd become extraordinarily skilled at faking enthusiasm. Could deliver presentations with energy that looked authentic, could frame tedious tasks as interesting challenges, could express excitement about initiatives he found fundamentally boring. This performance of enthusiasm was itself exhausting, requiring constant management of his own emotional displays to maintain the appearance of investment. Why does rest feel like guilt? This question emerged after Arman took a sick day, actual sickness, a flu that made working impossible, and spent the day in bed feeling not just physically unwell but psychologically uncomfortable with the fact of not working. Even when legitimately unable to perform, he felt guilty about the absence, as if his value as a person was predicated on constant productivity and any pause represented moral failure. He'd internalized a worldview where rest was something you earned through exhaustion rather than something required for sustainable functioning. Where taking time off felt like stealing from the organization even though it was explicitly part of his employment contract. Where vacation days accumulated and used because using them felt like admitting weakness or lack of commitment. The realization that he couldn't rest without guilt felt like evidence of something fundamentally broken in how he'd constructed his life. But he didn't know how to fix it without dismantling everything. Why does my calendar belong to everyone except me? Arman pulled up his calendar and examined a typical week, 47 scheduled commitments, ranging from 15-minute status checks to 3-hour strategy sessions. Every block of time allocated to someone else's priorities, client needs, colleague requests, organizational obligations. Nowhere in that week did he see time scheduled for himself, for thinking or reflection or pursuing any interest not immediately tied to work deliverables. His time had become entirely colonized by other people's agendas. He'd become, in essence, a resource to be allocated rather than a person with his own purposes. And he'd allowed this to happen, had even facilitated it by being so consistently available, so reliably responsive, so professionally accommodating. The questions accumulated, each one destabilizing comfortable narratives he'd been maintaining about why his life was structured as it was. And beneath all the specific questions ran one deeper, more frightening inquiry: who am I when I'm not performing professional success? Arman had spent 18 years building an identity around achievement. His sense of self had become inseparable from his role. Senior consultant at Davidson and Partners wasn't just what he did, it was who he was. Remove that, and what remained? He genuinely didn't know. And that uncertainty was terrifying. The decision arrived not as dramatic epiphany but as quiet certainty that accumulated over weeks of questioning until it became undeniable. Arman couldn't continue living as he had been living. Something had to change. The options, as he understood them. Continue as he was, accepting that this was simply what adult professional life looked like and that his dissatisfaction was a personal failure to appreciate his advantages, try to adjust within his current role, set better boundaries, delegate more, find ways to inject more meaning into existing work, leave entirely. Start over. Build something different. Option 1 meant resigning himself to permanent exhaustion. Option 2 required believing that incremental changes would address what felt like fundamental misalignment. Option 3 terrified him but also, increasingly, felt like the only honest choice. Arman spent a weekend doing financial calculations. If he lived modestly, smaller apartment, fewer luxuries, dramatically reduced expenses, his savings could sustain him for approximately 3 years without income. Longer if he did consulting work selectively rather than committing to full-time employment. This timeline felt simultaneously generous, 3 years, and terrifyingly finite, only 3 years. He made lists of fears and counterarguments. Fear: I'll regret giving up everything I've built. Counter: I'm already regretting building something that doesn't fulfill me. Fear: people will think I failed. Counter: people's opinions are based on incomplete information about my internal experience. Fear: I won't know what to do with myself. Counter: I haven't genuinely explored what I'd want to do when freed from financial necessity. Fear: I'll run out of money and have to return to this kind of work from a position of weakness. Counter: I have marketable skills that will remain marketable. This isn't irreversible. The counterarguments felt true but thin against the weight of 18 years of professional identity. On a Monday morning in early November, Arman arrived at work early as usual, rode the elevator to the 42nd floor, walked past colleagues exchanging greetings, sat at his desk with its panoramic city views, and opened a blank document. He typed 2 sentences: I am resigning my position at Davidson and Partners, effective in 4 weeks. I appreciate the opportunities I've been given here. Then he stared at those sentences for 20 minutes, cursor blinking, his finger hovering over the delete key. This was reversible right up until he sent it. He could close the document, continue his day, maintain the life he'd built. Safe. Predictable. Increasingly unbearable. Arman added details: appreciation for specific colleagues, commitment to smooth transition, willingness to help train his replacement. Professional: cordial, revealing nothing of his actual reasons. Then he addressed it to his managing partner and copied HR. His hand trembled slightly as he moved the cursor to send. The reaction was immediate. Within 30 minutes, his managing partner appeared at his office door. "Can we talk?" The conversation followed a pattern Arman recognized from when other valued employees had resigned: expression of surprise, inquiry about whether this was really what he wanted, probing for whether it was about money or position or interpersonal conflict. Arman's managing partner was skilled at retention conversations, and he deployed that skill now with the expectation that whatever Arman's concerns were, they could be addressed through negotiation. "What would it take to keep you?" The question assumed Arman was leaving because something about his current situation was insufficient and could be remedied through better compensation or position. But that wasn't the issue. "It's not about what the firm could offer me," Arman said carefully. "It's about what I've realized I want from my life, which isn't compatible with what this role requires. Which is space. Time that isn't scheduled. Work that feels meaningful to me rather than just profitable. A life that doesn't require constant performance." His managing partner looked genuinely confused, as if Arman had suddenly started speaking a language he couldn't comprehend. In the firm's logic, what Arman described wasn't success, it was opting out, giving up, failing to leverage opportunities. "You've built an impressive career here. You have prospects for partnership. You're walking away from that for, what, exactly?" "For the possibility of building something that feels mine rather than just well executed." The conversation continued for 40 minutes, but its outcome was predetermined. Arman had made his decision not impulsively but through weeks of careful consideration. No counteroffer would address his actual concerns because his concerns weren't transactional. News spread through the firm with remarkable speed. By midday, colleagues were stopping by his office, some expressing confusion, some concern, a few congratulating him in ways that suggested they envied what they perceived as courage but lacked themselves. The most revealing conversation was with Priya, a colleague he'd worked alongside for 7 years. She closed his office door and said bluntly, "What do you know that I don't?" "Nothing, probably. Just different tolerance for continuing like this." "Like what?" "Exhausted. Performing enthusiasm I don't feel. Building a career I no longer want." Priya was quiet for a long moment. "I think about leaving constantly. But I can't figure out what I'd do instead, and that uncertainty feels worse than staying with what I know." "I don't know what I'll do either," Arman admitted. "But I've realized that not knowing while being exhausted is worse than not knowing while having capacity to explore." His final 4 weeks at the firm were strange. He was simultaneously still there and already gone, present but disconnected, executing responsibilities while knowing they'd soon be someone else's concern. He documented his projects with meticulous detail, briefed his replacement extensively, tied up loose ends with the professionalism that had defined his tenure. And with each passing day, despite the uncertainty about what came next, Arman felt incrementally lighter. As if he'd been carrying weight he'd stopped noticing until the prospect of setting it down made him aware of how heavy it had become. The first month after leaving was disorienting. Arman's body, trained by 18 years of routine, still woke at 5:30. But instead of showering and preparing for work, he'd lie in bed experiencing the strangeness of having nothing he had to do. No meetings demanding his presence, no emails requiring immediate response, no calendar organizing his time into 15-minute increments of productivity. This freedom felt, initially, like falling. Like he'd stepped off a cliff and was waiting to hit ground that never came. The structure that had been oppressive when mandatory became disturbingly absent when optional. What did people do with mornings when they didn't have to optimize them for productivity? Arman experimented. He'd make coffee slowly, actually tasting it rather than consuming it as fuel. He'd sit by his window and watch the city wake up, notice things he'd been too rushed to observe for years, the quality of morning light changing across seasons, the rhythms of his neighbors' routines, the street cleaner who worked the block at 6:45 every morning with the same methodical attention Arman had once brought to spreadsheets. He read books. Not business books designed to optimize performance, but fiction that served no practical purpose except the experience of reading it. He rediscovered capacity for absorption that had been colonized by work, could spend 3 hours with a novel and emerge feeling satisfied rather than guilty about wasted time. He walked miles, aimlessly, through neighborhoods he'd only ever transited through without seeing. The city revealed itself differently at walking pace, detail and texture that disappeared at commuter speed. He'd stop at cafes not because he needed coffee but because sitting and watching people felt interesting. Would observe interactions and dynamics without the professional reflex to categorize and strategize. But the adjustment wasn't smooth. Arman experienced withdrawal from structure and validation. He'd find himself checking his phone compulsively, expecting emails that no longer came, missing the constant stream of demands that had been exhausting but had also confirmed his importance. Without the external validation of professional achievement, he struggled to maintain sense of self-worth. If he wasn't succeeding at work, what evidence existed that he had value? Financial anxiety surfaced despite his careful planning. Every purchase became fraught with awareness that he was spending savings rather than income. He'd moved to a smaller apartment, from 2 bedrooms to a modest 1-bedroom in a less prestigious neighborhood, and the downgrade felt simultaneously liberating and like evidence of failure. He'd sold his car, started using public transit, stopped buying expensive coffee, learned to cook simple meals rather than ordering delivery. These changes were voluntary and aligned with his values, but they also triggered shame, evidence that he wasn't successful by the metrics he'd internalized. Social relationships revealed themselves in new light. Some friends expressed support, others confusion or veiled disapproval. Dinner conversations became awkward when people asked what he was doing now and, nothing specific, just exploring, didn't satisfy their need for categorizable narrative. He could see them mentally filing him under crisis or midlife breakdown or gave up, unable to comprehend voluntary stepping back as anything except failure. His parents, immigrants who'd sacrificed enormously to provide educational opportunities Arman had leveraged into professional success, struggled to understand his decision. "You worked so hard to get there," his mother said during a tense phone call. "Why would you leave?" How could he explain that getting there had required becoming someone he didn't recognize? That success by their metrics, financial security, professional status, stable career, felt hollow when disconnected from any sense of purpose beyond achievement itself. "I'm not happy," he said simply. "Happiness is luxury," his father responded, not unkindly but with the worldview of someone who prioritized survival and advancement over emotional fulfillment. Stability matters more. Arman understood their perspective. Wasn't dismissing it. But he was 40 years old, financially secure, without dependence, in a position to prioritize differently than they'd been able to. His choices were enabled by privileges they'd helped create. But they saw his decision as squandering what they'd sacrificed to provide. The guilt was real and persistent. Not enough to make him regret his choice, but enough to complicate any simple narrative about liberation. 3 months after resigning, Arman was contacted by a former colleague who'd started a nonprofit focused on helping immigrant entrepreneurs navigate business systems. She needed strategic advice but lacked budget to pay market rates for consulting. Would Arman consider helping pro bono? He agreed, expecting to provide a few hours of advice. Instead, he found himself genuinely engaged in ways his corporate work hadn't achieved in years. These were people whose challenges were immediate and meaningful, not optimizing quarterly returns but building sustainable livelihoods, not managing perceptions but solving concrete problems. Their questions were urgent without being manufactured urgency, important without being inflated importance. Arman found he enjoyed mentoring in ways he'd never enjoyed managing. The relationship was collaborative rather than hierarchical, focused on helping others achieve their goals rather than coordinating their labor toward organizational objectives. He'd meet with entrepreneurs in coffee shops and community centers, would listen to their situations and constraints, would offer frameworks and analysis without the corporate jargon that had become reflexive. The work reminded him of why he'd been drawn to business strategy originally, before it became primarily about generating revenue for organizations that already had plenty of it. There was satisfaction in helping someone understand their cost structure, in identifying opportunities they'd missed, in translating complex concepts into accessible language. Not because it advanced his career or generated impressive numbers for quarterly reports, but because it concretely helped specific people build better lives. Word spread through informal networks. Other entrepreneurs reached out. Arman found himself volunteering 10 to 15 hours weekly, providing expertise that would have cost thousands if purchased through conventional consulting channels. He charged nothing, accepting occasionally coffee or meals as informal compensation, finding the work satisfying precisely because it wasn't transactional. This wasn't retirement. Wasn't checking out or giving up or any of the frameworks people had imposed on his decision. It was redirection, taking skills he developed in corporate contexts and applying them to work that felt meaningful, engaging with problems that interested him rather than ones that paid best, building relationships based on genuine mutual interest rather than professional networking. He also started writing, not for publication, not strategically, just thinking through concepts and questions that interested him. Blog posts about organizational dynamics, essays exploring why corporate cultures so often became toxic despite good intentions, reflections on alternative approaches to measuring success. Some of this writing found audience online, generated discussions, connected him with people thinking about similar questions. Arman wasn't building a new career intentionally. Wasn't following a plan or pursuing specific goals. Was just exploring. Seeing what interested him when financial pressure wasn't dictating his choices. Discovering that work could be engaging when it wasn't primarily about proving value or maintaining position or meeting others' expectations. 6 months after resigning, someone asked if he missed his old life. Arman had to think about the question carefully because the honest answer was complex. He missed elements, the intellectual challenge of complex problems, the satisfaction of working with competent colleagues, even some aspects of the prestige and compensation. But more than missing those things, he appreciated having space to miss them, to recognize what he'd valued versus what he'd tolerated, to distinguish between aspects of that life that were genuinely good from aspects that had simply been familiar. "I don't miss being busy," he answered finally. "I miss thinking I had to be." The person asking looked confused, waiting for elaboration. But Arman didn't have more to offer. The statement contained everything. He'd internalized belief that constant busyness was virtue, that filling every hour was success, that rest and space were luxuries to be earned rather than necessities for sustainable living. And releasing that belief, stopping the perpetual chase, felt like the most significant achievement of his adult life. 18 months after leaving Davidson and Partners, Arman stood in his modest apartment and recognized he'd become someone he hadn't been in years, someone who knew what he wanted and wasn't ashamed of wanting it. The clarity hadn't arrived dramatically but through accumulated experiences of trying things and noticing what generated genuine interest versus what he felt he should be interested in. He'd learned he cared about teaching. Not in formal academic contexts but in helping people understand systems that would otherwise remain opaque. He'd started conducting workshops for immigrant entrepreneurs, teaching business fundamentals without business jargon, making accounting and marketing and strategic thinking accessible to people who'd never had formal business education. He'd learned he enjoyed writing when freed from corporate constraints. His blog about organizational culture and alternative approaches to success had developed following, not massive, but substantial enough that publishers had approached him about book proposals. He was considering it, though not with the urgency his former self would have brought. If he wrote a book, it would be because he had something to say, not because publication would validate his choice to leave corporate life. He'd learned he needed far less money than he'd thought. His expenses had stabilized at roughly 40% of his previous spending, and this reduction felt like expansion rather than constraint. He had fewer possessions but more agency over his time. Lower income but greater alignment between his values and his choices. The social judgment had mostly faded. People had initially been confused by his decision, but 18 months of watching him seem genuinely satisfied rather than desperately pretending gradually shifted narratives. Some colleagues from Davidson and Partners had even reached out, asking how he'd known it was time to leave, expressing their own dissatisfaction with careers that looked impressive but felt empty. His parents remained somewhat puzzled but had stopped expressing overt concern. His mother had said recently, "You seem lighter. Less tired." This observation meant more to Arman than any professional accolade he'd received. The earlier question, who was he when not performing professional success, had been answered through 18 months of exploration. He was someone who valued autonomy over status, meaning over money, genuine engagement over strategic performance. Someone who'd rather help 10 entrepreneurs build sustainable businesses than optimize one corporation's quarterly returns. Someone who measured success not by accumulation but by alignment between his values and his life. This wasn't universal wisdom. Other people might find genuine fulfillment in corporate careers, might thrive on the structure and challenges Arman had found exhausting. His choice to leave wasn't judgment on everyone who stayed, it was recognition of his own needs and limitations, acknowledgement that the life he'd built wasn't sustainable for him regardless of how it appeared from outside. But Arman suspected he wasn't alone. Suspected many people who appeared successful were carrying similar exhaustion, similar questions about whether their impressive-looking lives were actually serving them. Suspected the street musician he'd noticed months ago, playing guitar with genuine pleasure despite minimal material success, understood something important that professional achievement culture systematically obscured, that satisfaction and success weren't synonymous, that optimization could become its own trap, that stopping the perpetual chase might be the most courageous choice available. Success isn't what you collect, it's what you're willing to let go of. This is what Arman learned through 18 months of unlearning 18 years of professional conditioning. That the impressive-looking life he'd built was actually a prison constructed from obligations he could no longer remember choosing, sustained by fear of judgment and inability to imagine alternatives. But here's the crucial nuance, Arman's story isn't a prescription for everyone to quit their jobs and pursue vague notions of authenticity. It's not anti-ambition or anti-career or suggesting that professional achievement is inherently hollow. Some people find genuine fulfillment in careers that demand intensity and reward it with satisfaction. Some people's authentic selves thrive in corporate environments and competitive contexts. The call to action is subtler and harder. Examine whether the life you're building is actually one you want to live, or whether you're constructing it based on expectations you've internalized without questioning. Ask yourself the uncomfortable questions Arman eventually couldn't avoid. When did I last feel genuinely excited about my work rather than just competently executing it? If I weren't afraid of judgment, of financial insecurity, of disappointing people who admire my success, what would I choose differently? Why do I feel guilty about rest? What belief system am I operating under that treats downtime as theft rather than necessity? Who am I when I'm not performing professional achievement? Do I know? Do I want to find out? These questions have no universal answers. For some people, honest examination will reveal genuine alignment between their values and their lives. For others, it will reveal misalignment that requires adjustment, not necessarily dramatic reinvention but boundary setting, priority shifting, releasing obligations that serve others' agendas rather than their own purposes. And for some, like Arman, honest examination will reveal that the entire structure needs dismantling and rebuilding. That incremental adjustment won't address fundamental misalignment. That the only way forward is stepping back, creating space, allowing new possibilities to emerge rather than perpetually optimizing existing trajectories. If you're reading this while exhausted by a success that looks impressive but feels hollow, while performing enthusiasm you don't feel, while building a resume rather than a life, know that alternatives exist. Know that leaving isn't failing. Know that redefining success on your own terms rather than accepting cultural defaults is available to you. But also know it's hard. Will involve uncertainty and judgment and loss of things you've worked years to achieve. Will require tolerance for not knowing what comes next while trusting your capacity to figure it out. Will mean disappointing some people whose opinions you value. The question is whether that difficulty is worth it. Whether continuing as you are, sustaining impressive-looking exhaustion, is more tolerable than the discomfort of transformation. Only you can answer that. But answering it requires first admitting the question exists, that the life you've built might not be the life you want to keep living regardless of how it appears from outside. Arman's story offers permission more than prescription, permission to question, to want differently, to value satisfaction over status, to measure success by alignment rather than achievement. Permission to stop when stopping serves your well-being even if it confuses people who admire your trajectory. You don't have to be exhausted to be valuable. You don't have to be constantly busy to be worthwhile. You don't have to sacrifice your well-being to prove your dedication. These beliefs, widespread in professional culture, are choices, not requirements. And they're choices you're allowed to decline. Success isn't what you collect, it's what you're willing to let go of. Be story-wise.